A back road, a quiet engine, an old woman heading home before nightfall. The folded flag on her dash wasn't decoration. It was memory, sacrifice, love. The sky was turning to fire. The fields whispered. Time moved slow. Then came the sirens, the glare, the barked orders. She kept her voice calm, her hands visible, her history invisible. No crime, no warning, just bruises. She was slammed to the ground like a threat, cuffed like a secret, locked away like silence. They thought she was no one, just another tired black woman with nowhere to be, until the judge walked in and said in a voice colder than steel, "You laid hands on the woman who raised me. Where are you watching from and what time is it there? Let us know in the comments." It was just after 6:30 p.m. when Angela Freeman turned onto the old county road that curved between fields of wheat and quiet woods. The sun had dropped low enough to stain the horizon gold, and the cicadas buzzed like they always did at this time of year, tired, steady, relentless. Her hands gripped the steering wheel loosely, fingers stiff from shelving books all day at the town library. But her mind was somewhere else, entirely drifting between memories of her husband's folded flag and what she might cook for dinner. Tonight, she didn't speed. She never did. Not at her age and not on roads where the white lines had long since faded and every mailbox looked like it belonged to someone she used to know. The radio hummed something from the 70s, Sam Cooke maybe, and the passenger seat held nothing but a paper bag of groceries, a navy blue scarf, and a small photo of her late husband clipped to the visor. His face looked out over the dashboard like a guardian watching the road ahead, a gentle reminder that some things are still sacred even if the world forgets. She didn't notice the patrol car at first, not until the headlights flared in her rearview mirror and the engine roared just a little louder than it needed to. The road was empty. There was no traffic, no cross streets, no sudden stops. So when the red and blue lights blinked to life, Angela's chest tightened, not with guilt, but with a quiet, heavy dread she knew far too well. Not again, she thought. Not for nothing. She eased the car onto the gravel shoulder and turned off the engine. The cicadas kept buzzing. The fields stood still. Her fingers hovered above her purse as she took a slow breath and whispered to herself, "Just stay calm, be clear, don't give them a reason." It was something she'd told her younger self, something she used to say to Marcus when he was still a lanky teenager, learning how to exist safely in a world that kept mistaking his confidence for defiance. The footsteps came slow. Heavy boots crunching over dry gravel, the sound exaggerated in the stillness. Angela didn't look up right away. She kept her hands on the wheel as steady as a chapel pew until a voice barked from behind her window, sharp loud with that clipped authority that doesn't ask so much as command. "Ma'am, roll down your window." She turned the crank, her car still had the old manual kind, and looked up into the face of a white man in uniform, probably mid-30s, close-cropped blonde hair, jaw clenched like a man who chewed on rules for breakfast. His eyes didn't blink much. They just stared, scanning her like she was a package without a label. "You live around here?" he asked, and it wasn't curiosity in his tone, it was suspicion already settled like dust on a windowsill. Angela nodded. "I live up on Mercer Ridge. Been there nearly 20 years. You driving so slow for a reason?" he asked, voice flat but edged like cold iron. She kept her eyes on the mirror. "I wasn't aware I was speeding or slowing, officer. Just heading home after work." He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned in, closer gaze, shifting to the photograph on her visor. His lip twitched, half sneer, half smirk. "That your husband?" Angela didn't answer right away. Then evenly she said, "Yes, sir. 25 years in the Army. Passed in '09. For a moment there was silence, just the wind whispering through the wheat and the faint creak of the patrol car's engine idling. Then he straightened up and said, "License and registration. Step out of the vehicle after you hand them over." Angela blinked. "Is there a reason for the stop?" The man's eyes narrowed. "You're resisting a lawful order." Her hand trembled just slightly as she reached into her purse, slow, careful, practiced. She handed over her license and papers, then placed her hands back on the wheel. "I'm not resisting anything," she said, her voice steady but soft. "Just asking why." In one motion, he pulled open the door. "Step out of the car. Now." Angela's body tensed. Her knees didn't move right away. It wasn't fear that froze her, it was disbelief. She hadn't even raised her voice. She hadn't done anything. "Sir," she said quietly, "I have arthritis in my knees. If you give me a second, I'll—" He didn't wait. The next moment happened too fast for memory to catch all the edges. His hand grabbed her arm, yanked it hard enough to twist her shoulders. Her head hit the top of the doorframe on the way out. She stumbled, tried to brace herself, but the gravel gave way beneath her feet and she landed hard knees. First palms scraped, breath knocked from her lungs. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he shouted, though they were already out in the open, trembling against the dirt. From where she lay, the sky looked dimmer than it had a minute ago. Angela tried to speak. "Officer, please," but he was already on top of her one knee, pressing into her lower back, one arm twisting hers behind her. "You're obstructing procedure," he said, not shouting now, just talking like it was routine. Angela clenched her jaw, swallowing the pain. Somewhere in the distance, the cicadas had stopped. Or maybe her ears just couldn't hear them anymore. She could feel her heart pounding, not with panic, but with the strange hot shame that comes when your dignity is stripped, not with noise, but with practiced quiet. And in that moment, lying face down on the side of a forgotten road, her husband's photo swinging slightly in the open door behind her, Angela Freeman understood something more bitter than pain. This man didn't see a librarian, didn't see a widow, didn't even see a woman. He saw a problem, and he had been trained to solve problems quickly. They didn't cuff her until she was halfway inside the patrol car, and even then it was done without ceremony, like it was just another box to check before the paperwork began. The plastic seat was cold against her back, the metal divider smudged with fingerprints and dust, and the air smelled faintly of leather polish and something sterile like the kind of clean that doesn't actually wash anything away. Angela sat as still as she could manage, her hands pinned awkwardly behind her wrists, aching from the pressure of the cuffs, while the door slammed shut beside her, with a finality that felt more personal than official. The drive to the sheriff's station was short, but every second stretched out like it was being pulled on a wire. The officer didn't speak, didn't look in the mirror, didn't explain where they were going or why she was being taken in. The only sound was the hum of the tires on asphalt and the occasional crackle of static on the radio, as if the silence itself was a kind of punishment, something designed not to contain her body but to isolate her mind. Angela stared straight ahead, watching the road signs blur into dusk, each one marking a mile. She hadn't agreed to travel each one, reminding her that even at 62, with a lifetime of service behind her, she could still be reduced to a suspect, without explanation. When they pulled into the lot, the patrol lights had already been switched off as if to keep her entry quiet, unnoticed, unrecorded. The station wasn't large, just a single building with a chipped flagpole, a set of double doors, and a flickering fluorescent bulb overhead that made everything beneath it look slightly unreal. The officer opened the door and gave a short command, out without offering help or even making eye contact. Angela slid out slowly, the cuffs digging deeper as she tried to balance her footing. She didn't say a word, not because she was afraid, but because she'd already decided that no amount of calmness would change what they'd chosen to see in her. Inside, the booking area was half-empty, dimly lit and humming with the low mechanical rhythm of printers, keyboards, and ventilation ducts. A younger deputy looked up as they walked in, then looked back down like she was seeing nothing new. No one asked for a statement. No one read her rights. They just scanned her ID, made a copy of her license, and took a photograph against a faded gray backdrop with the corners of the frame held in place by duct tape. She blinked as the flash went off. The light burned briefly into her vision like a small white lie that left a sting. They led her into a holding room without a clock. The bench was metal bolted to the floor, and the ceiling tiles were stained, the color of old teeth. Angela sat there in silence, the cuffs finally removed, but the ache in her shoulders lingering like a bruise that hadn't yet surfaced. She didn't ask what time it was. She didn't ask how long she would be there. Because the truth was, she already knew no one planned to tell her. At some point, maybe an hour later, maybe more, a sergeant stepped in, carrying a clipboard and a coffee cup. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask how she was doing. He just set the clipboard down on the table and said, "Refusal to comply. Verbal challenge to officer. No further action at this time." Then he looked at her almost curious. "You got anyone you want to call?" She opened her mouth, but before she could answer, he added, "Phone lines are tied up right now. Might be a while." Angela closed her eyes. Not to cry, not to pray, just to breathe. Deep, slow, quiet. She remembered the way the wind had sounded on the road before the sirens, how the light had slanted through the trees just right. She remembered thinking about dinner, about Marcus, about the photo of her husband now forgotten in the car like a relic no one cared enough to steal. She remembered everything except the moment when she stopped being Angela and became a stop, a code, a female subject, detained a file someone would skim, then forget. She spoke only once and it was quiet. "I'd like to speak to a lawyer." The sergeant chuckled, not mean, just amused. "This isn't that kind of situation, ma'am. You're just being held for safety evaluation." She tilted her head. "Whose safety?" He didn't answer. Just sipped his coffee and walked out the door like it didn't matter. The hours passed without names, without clocks, without context. At some point, a younger officer peeked in, glanced at her face, and for a brief second his expression shifted, not pity, not guilt, but something closer to discomfort, like he'd seen something he didn't want to carry home with him. But he said nothing. None of them did. It was easier that way. Angela sat there, not angry, not broken, but very, very still, because she understood now, in a way she hadn't before, that silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was a method, a tool, a way to make people disappear without ever raising a voice. And in that silence, she made a choice not to forget, not to forgive, and not to wait for someone else to define what had happened to her. Because the moment they took away her name, she began writing their failure in her own memory. And she would not let them keep it. Judge Marcus Bell had just finished reviewing a housing discrimination appeal when his assistant buzzed in softly through the intercom voice, careful, almost hesitant, like she already knew the name on the file would matter. "Sir, a routine arrest log came through from Harper County. They marked it for observation due to detainee age." She paused. "Name reads Angela Freeman." He froze mid-sentence. The sound of the name alone cracked through the calm of his office like a distant thunderclap, one that hadn't yet reached the ground but already rearranged the sky. He pushed his chair back, slowly opened the system dashboard, and typed the name in full hands, steady but blood running colder by the second. There it was. The name he had written 100 times in thank you cards, scholarship essays, and birthday letters that were never fancy but always heartfelt. Angela Freeman, 62, female, black, detained without formal charge pending review. No attorney listed, no emergency contact, no health status recorded, just a digital footprint barely big enough to prove she existed. For a long second, Marcus just sat there staring at the screen. The sun outside had started slipping behind the skyline, casting long shadows through the tall windows stretching across the desk, like quiet reminders that time was moving forward whether he was ready or not. His heart began to pound, not from fear, but from something far more dangerous: recognition. Angela wasn't just another name in the system. She was the reason he even had a place in it. She had taken him in when his mother passed, just a neighbor at first, then a tutor, then the only grown-up who saw promise in a boy with uneven grades, chipped glasses, and a chip on his shoulder. She'd sat across from him at her kitchen table with a pot of weak coffee and a stack of flashcards, saying over and over, "Your brain's a key, Marcus. You just gotta figure out what door it fits." And now she was in a cell, somewhere, alone, unnamed. And nobody in the department had thought to check twice. He stood up, grabbed his coat off the back of the chair, and said only 4 words to his assistant as he passed her desk. "Cancel everything until tomorrow." The air outside was colder than he expected, crisp with the bite of coming winter, and as he walked toward his car, the sound of his own footsteps echoed louder than they had in years. He didn't drive with urgency, he drove with purpose. A quiet, coiled determination that grew heavier with every mile of empty highway until the courthouse lights were long behind him, and only the flat fields of Harper County remained ahead, glowing faintly under the last light of day. When he arrived at the sheriff's department, the building looked like every other small-town station he'd ever known. Low roof, one flag, the hum of vending machines just inside the double doors. But what he felt as he stepped inside wasn't routine. It was personal. He approached the front desk, where a young deputy looked up, eyes blank with routine. "Can I help you, sir?" "I'm here to see Angela Freeman," Marcus said, pulling out his ID, letting the silver seal of the circuit court glint just enough to be understood but not flashed like a threat. The deputy's eyebrows rose slightly. "One moment, Judge Bell." He disappeared behind the partition, and Marcus stood alone in the reception area, hands folded loosely in front of him, heart slowing now that action had replaced shock. A few minutes later, a different officer returned, older, with a name tag that read Sergeant Harlan. He walked like a man who had too much to explain and no idea how to start. "We weren't aware, well, there was no emergency contact she didn't mention." Marcus raised a hand. "I'm not here for excuses. I'm here for her." Sergeant Harlan nodded slowly, then led him through a series of dull beige hallways, every wall decorated with faded posters about de-escalation and ethics, the kind of messaging designed for appearances, not accountability. They stopped in front of a door with no name on it, just holding 3 etched in peeling black letters. He didn't brace himself before walking in. He didn't need to, because the moment he saw her sitting on that metal bench head, high eyes alert, hands resting neatly in her lap, he felt something shift deep inside him, not just anger or sadness, but a profound sorrow that this country, after all its promises, still knew how to humiliate its best people in quiet, efficient ways. Angela looked up, and when their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. She didn't cry. She didn't ask why he was there. She just gave him that familiar half-nod she used to give when he got an answer right. And he knew in that instant that she was still who she'd always been, unshaken, unbent, and quietly, devastatingly strong. He stepped closer, lowered his voice. "I'm sorry it took me this long to get here." Her voice was soft even. "Took you exactly when I needed you, baby. Don't you apologize for timing you didn't choose?" Marcus exhaled, his chest loosening for the first time since he saw her name. He sat down on the bench beside her, shoulders close, but not touching, just like they used to when he was too proud to ask for help and she was too wise to push. "I'm going to fix this," he said, not as a judge but as a man who owed everything to the woman beside him. Angela gave a faint smile, the kind that didn't reach her lips but lived behind her eyes. "You're not here to fix it, Marcus. You're here to name it." He didn't respond right away, just nodded. And in that silence something powerful took root, a vow not spoken but understood. This wouldn't be buried. Not this time. They let her out just after midnight. No explanation, no paperwork in hand, just a folded jacket, a plastic bag with her belongings, and a muttered, "You're free to go." Angela didn't ask questions. She had learned long ago that the answers they offered never touched the real truth. She stepped out into the parking lot with slow, even steps, the night air wrapping around her like a cold shawl. The lights above flickered once, buzzing softly, casting a faint halo over the cracked concrete and chain-link fence. Marcus stood waiting near the far corner, not under the lights but just beyond them where the dark met the outline of his car. His hands were in his coat pockets, his shoulders squared like someone preparing to carry something much heavier than a legal case. When Angela saw him, she didn't smile, didn't cry, just gave a single short nod, the kind that says more than words can carry. He walked toward her without rush, without ceremony, and they met in the middle, neither of them reaching out, but somehow both held steady by the other's presence. "You all right?" he asked, voice low measured. Angela looked him in the eye. "I'm standing. That's enough for now." He gave the barest flicker of a smile, not from relief but from respect. They walked to the car side by side, their footsteps soft against the gravel, not speaking again until the doors closed behind them, and the engine hummed to life like an old friend trying to remember a forgotten tune. The drive back to her house was quiet but not heavy, the kind of silence that lives between two people who have already survived the worst parts of their lives and know that anything that follows will be faced with a steady breath and a clear spine. Angela kept her gaze out the window, watching the moonlight play across the empty fields and telephone wires, her reflection faint against the glass, aged, yes, but whole. "You know," Marcus said, after a few minutes, not looking at her, just watching the road ahead, "when I was 17, I almost didn't take that scholarship." Angela turned slightly toward him. "I remember. You thought staying close to home meant you were being loyal." He nodded, a small laugh escaping through his nose. "And you told me, loyalty without growth is just fear with good manners." "I was feeling bold that day," she said quietly, a hint of warmth breaking through. "You were right," he replied. "I owe you more than law school. I owe you who I became." Angela didn't say anything at first. Then after a long pause she asked, "So now that you're the one in the big chair, What will you do with that debt? Marcus didn't answer right away. He gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, the skin at his knuckles pulling white. I'll do what you taught me. I'll look this thing in the face and call it by its name. Outside, the wind shifted slightly, brushing against the trees in a way that made them whisper old secrets. Angela looked ahead. Her voice came soft but firm. Don't come at this as a son. Come as someone who knows how the machine works. He nodded again. That's the only way it breaks. They pulled into her driveway a few minutes later, the house still and dark except for the porch light she always left on just in case. Marcus got out first, walked around to her side, opened the door like it was a ritual he still remembered from long ago, back when she used to drive him to school in her old Buick, always giving him one last quiet piece of advice before he slammed the door too hard and walked off, pretending not to need her. Angela stepped out, her knees still sore, one hand pressed briefly against the car for balance. He reached for her arm, but she shook her head gently. I've got it. Inside, the house smelled like thyme, books, wood polish, something faintly herbal and grounding. Nothing had changed. The photos were still on the mantel, the mismatched mugs still on the hooks above the sink. She moved through the space like it was part of her body, switching on lights in a familiar rhythm, grounding herself in the ordinary after the sheer absurdity of the last 24 hours. Marcus stood in the doorway, hands now out of his pockets, eyes scanning the walls. He stopped at a picture near the bookshelf, him in a graduation gown, her in a simple blouse, standing straight. No smile, but unmistakably proud. She knew you'd come, Angela said, following his gaze. He turned. Your mother, Angela said, and my sister. She always said if anything ever happened to me you'd come looking, not because you were told to, but because you'd feel it. In your bones. Marcus didn't respond. His throat was suddenly too tight. He walked to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down like a man who finally knew where to begin. I need to see everything, he said. Who stopped you, what they wrote, what they didn't. I need names, shifts, inconsistencies. If there's a pattern, I'll find it. Angela nodded slowly, then reached for a drawer near the hallway desk. She pulled out a small, leather-bound planner, pages marked with dates, notes, old appointments written in careful cursive. I don't remember everything, but I remember enough, she said. And you're not starting from scratch. You're just picking up where too many of us had to leave off. Marcus opened the planner, the pages crackling slightly under his fingers. And in that small moment, in that quiet room, with its worn carpets and steady lights, something unshakable began to form. Not vengeance, not even justice in the traditional sense, but memory, with purpose. And once memory starts walking forward with a name and a file and a voice behind it, there's no force in the world that can make it sit back down. The next morning began with black coffee and silence, the kind that doesn't demand conversation but invites focus. Marcus sat at Angela's dining table, the worn leather planner open beside his laptop, the cursor blinking like a slow heartbeat. Outside, the light came in soft through the curtains, casting gentle shadows across the wood floors, and the old quilt Angela kept draped across the back of her armchair. The house smelled of rosemary and dust of familiarity and mornings that hadn't yet been touched by outrage. He began by searching public arrest records for the county, filtering down by date, time, and type of stop. The data looked like a spreadsheet of mundane details, timestamps, zip codes, badge numbers, but Marcus didn't see columns. He saw patterns. There it was. Officer T. Lyle, badge 47,392. Multiple traffic stops between 10:00 p.m. and 1:00 a.m. on rural roads that shared one thing in common: low lighting, sparse witnesses, and a high concentration of Black or Latino residents. His fingers moved fast, but his eyes stayed slow, scanning for anomalies, matching names against outcomes. 3 stops resulted in citations. 9 ended in release without charges. 5 had no outcome listed at all, just verbal warning or subject evaluated. Those words sounded harmless until you read them stacked together one after another like a paper trail written in invisible ink. Angela entered the room quietly, wrapped in a shawl, holding a warm mug in both hands like it was something alive. "Find anything worth shaking yet?" she asked, not with hope, but with the weariness of someone who has learned that answers don't always mean resolution. Marcus nodded. "He's been doing this a while." Same times, same roads. Most of it never escalates. Not until it does. Angela sat across from him, sipping her tea slowly, watching the screen as if it might explain why her knees still ached from gravel. They've trained themselves to go right up to the edge, she said. Just far enough to hurt, not far enough to trigger alarm bells. Marcus typed as she spoke, her voice guiding his search like a compass cutting through fog. He opened complaint databases, sorted through reports filed, and quietly dismissed. Most had no follow-up. One mentioned inappropriate language without quoting it. Another described physical discomfort during detainment but was flagged no visible injury. A third, filed by an elderly man named Harold Spence, described being pulled from his car and called suspicious for driving with his seat leaned back. He was 72, Marcus murmured. They said he matched a description. Angela raised an eyebrow. That description got a lot of faces under its belt. He leaned back in the chair, letting the weight of the screen settle on him. These aren't isolated incidents, he said. They're quiet habits. Repeated enough times to feel routine. Documented just enough to seem legitimate. Angela set her mug down and folded her hands together, her gaze steady and unblinking. So what do you do when the routine is the problem? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled up the department's body cam policy footage, should be active for all traffic stops, stored for 30 days, retrievable upon formal request. Angela's footage was marked incomplete due to upload error. Of course it was, she said, voice dry. They always lose the camera when the truth doesn't behave. He opened another tab and requested all body cam footage tied to Officer Lyle in the past 90 days. The request returned one video recorded during a community picnic at the county fairgrounds. No arrests, no citations, just staged smiles and a brief clip of Lyle helping a child put on a plastic deputy's badge. Marcus stared at the still frame for a long moment, not because he didn't recognize the performance, but because he'd seen too many like it. I think he knows exactly where the shadows are, Marcus said. And he stays in them on purpose. Angela nodded slowly. So what happens now? You find the shadows. What then? Marcus looked over at her, and for a second, she saw not the judge but the boy she once tutored, sleepless, stubborn, brilliant, and still carrying the weight of wanting to make her proud. Now I start building the light, he said. Not with outrage, with precision. He reached for a notebook, began outlining the dates, gathering badge numbers, cross-referencing arrest logs with complaint closures. He flagged inconsistencies, cataloged language, listed unanswered requests. The structure began to emerge, deliberate, repetitive, shielded by bureaucratic loopholes and administrative vagueness. Angela watched him work, her eyes softening but not retreating. She knew this wasn't just a legal process. This was a reclamation, a fight for language, for dignity, for the right to be seen in the records of a system designed to overlook. You know, she said quietly, they've gotten real good at making things look like they never happened. Marcus looked up. Then we'll give them something they can't erase. Outside, the morning light had grown sharper, slicing through the trees and scattering across the table. The screen glowed brighter, the files stacked deeper. And somewhere in that quiet room, between the soft clink of her mug and the steady rhythm of his keystrokes, a new shape began to form, not just a case, but a reckoning. And this time it wouldn't fade quietly into the archive. The envelope arrived on a Thursday, slipped between two grocery store flyers and a notice about leaf collection from the county. Angela didn't open it right away. It sat on the corner of her kitchen table, unopened for the better part of the morning, the gold-embossed return address barely visible under the soft glare of the window light. She stared at it in silence, her fingers tracing the edge slowly, as if she could feel the weight of what it carried before she even saw the words inside. Marcus had already left for the city by then, needing to return to his chambers for a morning hearing. He'd kissed her cheek gently, like when he was a boy, saying goodbye before school, and promised he'd be back before the weekend. "Call me if anything shows up," he'd said. And she had nodded, not knowing how soon that promise would be tested. It was nearly noon before she opened the envelope. The letter was brief, printed on heavy paper, the kind that doesn't fold easily. The tone was polite, deliberate, distant. They referred to it as a gesture of resolution from the department, a chance to move forward without unnecessary disruption or media involvement. The number printed beneath the paragraph wasn't large, but it wasn't small either. $45,000. Enough to patch the roof, replace the car, maybe even visit her sister out west like she'd always meant to. But that wasn't what made her hand tremble. It was the second page, the conditions. No public statement, no interviews, no legal proceedings. A full release of liability, and an acknowledgement that this matter was from that point on considered closed. Angela sat there for a long time, the letter resting on her lap, her eyes not reading the words anymore but letting them echo through her chest like something hollow and rehearsed. The kitchen was quiet, except for the ticking of the old clock above the sink. Its hands crawling forward like time itself had no interest in rushing her through this decision. She picked up the phone not to call a lawyer, not to call the department, but to call Marcus. When he answered, his voice was calm but alert. "Everything all right. They sent an offer," she said, simply, her voice low even. He didn't ask how much. He didn't ask what it said. He just stayed quiet long enough for her to keep going. 45,000, she continued, and silence. That's the exchange. He exhaled slowly on the other end, the kind of breath that holds more weight than words. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. Angela didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted to the window where a single bird was perched on the fence still and watching. "I feel like I just got handed a bill for my own dignity," she said. "And I don't know if I'm supposed to feel grateful they priced it that high or insulted it wasn't more." Marcus was quiet again. Then gently, "Whatever you decide, I'll stand behind it." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I know. That's why I had to call you first." Later that evening, she pulled the folded letter from the drawer and read it again, slower this time, as if testing each line for fractures. The language was so carefully worded, so clean, like a freshly painted wall hiding mold beneath. She imagined the men who wrote it, shirt sleeves, rolled up, ties, loosened, confident in the assumption that this would be enough to make her disappear politely. Angela rose from the table, moved toward the hallway, and opened the closet where she kept a small fireproof box. Inside were old documents, birth certificates, marriage papers, and tucked into the back, her husband's flag folded into that familiar triangle, corners sharp fabric smooth from decades of silence. She placed the letter next to it, not to keep it safe, but to remind herself what the flag had once meant and what it should never have to represent again. She stood there in the dim light of the hallway, one hand still resting on the box, and said out loud, not to anyone, but to the quiet, "They think this is about money, but this is about memory, and I'm not for sale." Her voice didn't shake, her hands didn't move. And in that stillness, she made her choice not because she wanted a fight, but because silence had already taken enough from her. Angela didn't sleep the night before the hearing. Not because she was afraid, not even because she was angry anymore, but because her body held the kind of tension that doesn't soften with sleep, the kind that comes from knowing tomorrow your voice might finally echo in rooms that had always been too quiet when it mattered. She sat at the kitchen table in the early hours, the lights dim, a single candle burning beside her cup of tea, casting slow-moving shadows across the faded linoleum. The house was still. The clock ticked like it had something to say, but was too polite to interrupt. The morning came gray and heavy, a soft drizzle darkening the front steps and flattening the sound of passing cars. Angela dressed slowly, choosing a simple navy suit she hadn't worn since her husband's funeral, the one with deep pockets and sleeves just long enough to cover the bruises still fading on her wrists. She tied her hair back, no makeup, no jewelry, just a plain gold wedding band and a pair of low black shoes that wouldn't click too loud on the courthouse floor. Marcus met her outside just before 8, his car idling by the curb windshield wipers moving back and forth like a metronome for the unsaid. He stepped out as she approached, umbrella in one hand folder tucked under the other, and opened the passenger door without a word. She climbed in, adjusted the seatbelt, and let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The heater clicked on, humming softly beneath the silence. "You ready?" Marcus asked, voice gentle, steady. Angela looked ahead through the streaked windshield. "I'm not sure that matters. What matters is they'll hear me anyway." The ride to the courthouse was quiet. The city rolled past their windows in slow gray waves, old brick buildings, shop signs just lighting up, people bundled against the cold, all moving through their morning, without knowing a reckoning was riding beside them in the back seat of a See ya done. When they pulled into the underground lot, Marcus parked without speaking, turned off the engine, and sat still for a moment, fingers resting on the wheel like he was waiting for permission to be something other than a judge. "I'll be right behind you," he said, eyes not on her but on the reflection in the mirror. Angela nodded once, then opened her door and stepped out into the echo of footsteps on concrete. The security checkpoint was quick. No bags, no medals, just a quiet nod from a young officer who looked up briefly, eyes flicking from her face to the bruises along her wrist, then quickly away. The courtroom wasn't full, not yet, but there were already a few eyes watching as she walked in, some curious, some indifferent, and one or two that flickered with recognition. She took her seat at the front with her attorneys, a team Marcus had helped assemble, sharp and deliberate but respectful of her pace. Across the room, the county's legal counsel shuffled papers with the efficient detachment of someone who had argued hundreds of cases and hoped this one would dissolve like the rest. Angela didn't look at them. She kept her eyes on the judge's bench, empty for now but heavy with the weight of what was to come. When her name was called, she stood slowly, spine straight, heart steady. She walked to the stand without glancing around the room, refusing to search for faces of comfort or confrontation. She placed her hand on the Bible not because she needed the symbolism, but because she knew too well the importance of keeping oaths. And then she began to speak. Her voice was low at first, clear but intimate, like she was telling a story she'd told before, but had only now been given permission to tell aloud. She spoke about the night, the stop, the hands on her body, the dirt on her knees, the silence in the cell. She didn't dramatize, didn't raise her voice, didn't break down. She simply described what it felt like to be made small by someone who didn't know her name, but had already decided she wasn't worth learning. "I wasn't a threat," she said plainly. "I wasn't loud. I wasn't armed. I wasn't anything but tired." But to him that was already too much. There was a stillness in the room as she spoke, not the awkward kind that comes from discomfort, but the deep, quiet attention that only arrives when truth is being named with precision. Even the opposing counsel had stopped shuffling. Even the bailiff had leaned slightly forward. "I'm not here today because I want revenge," she continued, voice steady. "I'm here because I've seen what silence allows. I've seen how it folds around the edges of these buildings, how it lives in these walls, and I refuse to add to it." She paused, then not for effect, but because her throat was dry and her eyes for just a second found Marcus in the back row. He didn't nod, didn't smile, he just held her gaze like an anchor, steady and unshaken. "I'm doing this," she said finally, "so the next woman who gets pulled over in the dark doesn't have to explain why she's angry. So she doesn't have to wonder if her bruises will even count. So she doesn't have to wonder if her life matters once it's reduced to paperwork." When she finished, no one clapped. No one needed to. The room didn't need applause. It needed accountability. Angela stepped down from the stand, her body aching in ways that had nothing to do with age, but everything to do with the cost of telling the truth in a world that counts on you keeping it to yourself. And as she walked back to her seat, something in the air shifted, not loud, not sudden, but permanent, because a system built on silence had just been interrupted by a woman who refused to forget. The courtroom felt different that morning, not louder, not busier, but charged in a way that made even the silence feel alert. There was something about the air, about the way people sat straighter in their seats, eyes forward, no small talk, no checking phones. The kind of stillness that only happens when a story is finally forcing itself into the light. Angela sat quietly at the front, hands folded on her lap, the soft lines of her face drawn tight but not tense, like someone bracing for a storm she'd already endured once before. Officer Travis Lyle was called to the stand. Just after 10, his uniform-pressed hair trimmed, sharp jaws set, like a man used to the comfort of being unquestioned. He walked with the kind of confidence that's been handed down by decades of systems designed to reward it. He didn't look at Angela, not once. He kept his eyes on the judge, the attorneys, the bailiff, anyone but the woman whose bruises had brought him here. He raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and took his seat like it was just another box to check before his shift ended. His lawyer began with the usual questions: length of service, prior commendations, commitment to community safety, the kind of language meant to establish credibility before anything human was ever discussed. When they got to the night of the stop, Lyle spoke in clean, clipped phrases, like a man repeating lines he'd rehearsed 100 times in front of a mirror. He said Angela was driving erratically, that she appeared agitated and non-compliant, that he followed department protocol to ensure officer safety. He said those words like armor, like magic spells, designed to silence everything else. But it was when the cross-examination began that the shape of the story started to shift. Marcus wasn't the one asking the questions. He'd stayed off the official team, choosing instead to sit quietly at the back, watching, listening. But the attorneys he'd assembled carried his precision like a torch. Officer Lyle, the lead attorney, began, her voice calm and deliberate. "When you say the defendant was non-compliant, could you clarify exactly what she did that constituted a refusal to comply?" Lyle straightened. "She questioned my instruction, asked why she was being pulled over, took several seconds to exit the vehicle. Is it department policy to define asking a question as non-compliance?" There was a pause. "It depends on the context." The attorney tilted her head. "Was she yelling, threatening, attempting to flee?" "No," he replied, a little sharper than before. "But she had a certain tone." That word hung in the air longer than the rest, like a note played too hard on a quiet piano. A few jurors shifted in their seats. Angela didn't move, but her eyes narrowed just slightly, as if she'd been waiting for that exact moment to arrive. "A tone," the attorney repeated. "Can you describe what that means?" Lyle hesitated. "It was dismissive. She acted like the rules didn't apply to her. It was a mistake. Not in content, he'd probably said it 100 times before, but in tone. Because the courtroom wasn't full of uniforms and silence anymore. It was full of citizens. And the moment he said those words, the illusion of control began to flicker. Angela's attorney leaned in slightly, her voice still steady. "And would you say that belief that someone like her thought she was above the rules justified physical force?" Lyle shifted in his chair. "I followed procedure. But the dash cam shows no resistance. And your own report admits there was no threat. Just tone." He opened his mouth, then closed it, blinked, swallowed. For the first time since stepping onto the stand, he looked unsure. And then came the surprise. "We'd like to introduce additional footage," the attorney said, turning to the judge, "provided voluntarily by a third-party witness present on the road that night." A murmur ran through the courtroom, not loud but enough to raise the hair on the back of your neck. A video began to play on the monitor facing the jury. Grainy from the dash of a truck driver who'd been parked on the shoulder a few 100 feet back. But clear enough. The screen showed Angela's car pulled over. It showed the officer's approach. It showed the moment he opened her door before she stepped out. Showed the way her body stumbled, not lunged. Showed the way she hit the ground without resistance. And it showed everything that didn't fit his report. No aggression, no sudden movements, no threat, just silence, then force. When the video ended, no one spoke right away. Not the judge, not the jury, not even the officer. Lyle's face had changed, not by much, but enough. The set of his jaw had softened. His eyes darted, looking for some way out of the moment. There wasn't one. Angela's attorney stepped forward one last time. "Officer Lyle," she said slowly, "would you like to amend any portion of your earlier testimony?" He cleared his throat. Maybe I misinterpreted her intentions." So she didn't resist. He looked down. No, it wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. But it landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through every silent assumption in the room. Angela exhaled, barely audible, her hands still folded. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She just sat there as steady as she had been since the beginning, while the truth, slow, quiet, undeniable, began to rise around her like light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. And for the first time since that night, the system didn't get to write the ending. By the time Angela returned home that evening, something had already begun to shift beyond her porch, beyond her quiet street, even beyond her small town. It didn't announce itself with headlines or camera crews, not yet, but it moved like a slow rising wind, steady and impossible to ignore. Inside the house, the air felt still, like it had paused to let her settle into what she'd just done. She hung her coat by the door, slipped off her shoes, and sat down in the living room without turning on the lights. The room held the dusk in its corners, the last bit of daylight pooling on the rug like a whisper from another world. Her body ached in familiar places, knees, shoulders, ribs, but the pain felt different now, no longer evidence of helplessness but of resistance. She closed her eyes, letting her breath slow, and for a long time she didn't think about the courtroom or the officer or the way the jurors had leaned forward during the footage. She thought only of the photo still clipped to the visor of her car, her husband's eyes looking forward, his folded uniform, his quiet sense of duty. He had once told her, "When you stand your ground, even silence hears you." She hadn't understood it then, but she did now. The next morning her phone buzzed before sunrise. First a text from Marcus, short and proud, "You were extraordinary." Then a second notification from a local reporter asking if she'd be willing to comment for a piece airing that night. Angela didn't answer right away. She set the phone down, boiled water for tea, and stood at the kitchen sink, watching the steam rise, her thoughts moving slower than the morning light spilling in through the curtains. By mid-afternoon there were 3 voicemails, 4 emails, and a handwritten letter slid under her front door, unsigned, but ending with the words, "Thank you for not staying quiet." It wasn't praise. She felt more like a soft tremble of shared memory, like the lives of strangers brushing up against hers without ever needing to say their names. These weren't fans. These were witnesses. And that made all the difference. The local news ran a segment that night, not flashy or dramatic, just 5 minutes of facts layered with footage from the courtroom and a voiceover that struck a careful balance between professionalism and disbelief. The reporter called it a civil rights moment unfolding in real time. They used the phrase pattern of behavior and systemic concern. But it wasn't the broadcast itself that changed things, it was what came after. Veterans groups reposted the segment with hashtags like #flag on the seat and #justice for Angela. Faith leaders mentioned her name in Sunday sermons not with fire and brimstone, but with the kind of quiet reverence usually reserved for hymnals. Former students who'd checked out books from her library decades ago began leaving messages on her fence, folded notes taped to the gate. "We remember how you made us feel seen." Even the flag on the dashboard, her husband's once just a folded triangle behind glass, had taken on a new meaning. Someone snapped a photo of it resting against the passenger seat in Angela's old car, posted it online with a caption that simply read, "He served this country. She survived it." The image spread faster than Angela could have imagined. Retweeted, reshared, captioned in articles and blog posts printed in black and white in the back pages of city newspapers. Strangers began calling it the Freeman flag. Angela watched it all unfold with the kind of stillness that doesn't come from shock but from age and memory and a lifetime of knowing how fast attention can turn into noise. She didn't feel famous. She felt visible, and that in itself was revolutionary. One afternoon she walked to the corner store and was stopped by a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25. She didn't ask for a photo or an autograph, just looked her in the eye and said, "You reminded me of my grandmother. She fought too. Thank you for making them remember." Angela placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder, nodded, and continued on her way without saying a word. But not all the responses were kind. An envelope arrived without a return address inside a single sheet of paper with the words, "Should have stayed in your place." Angela didn't flinch. She didn't tell Marcus. She didn't report it. She just folded it in half, slid it into the fireproof box in her hallway, and said softly to the walls, "That's exactly what they're afraid of, that I finally know where my place is. And it isn't silent." Marcus called that night to check on her. His voice, usually so composed, held a subtle tremor beneath it. "They're talking about it in chambers," he said. "Even the ones who never talk about anything." Angela smiled gently, stirring her tea. "Good. Maybe now they'll see that it doesn't take a riot to reveal the rot. Sometimes it just takes one woman refusing to pretend." He paused, then asked, "Do you regret it?" She didn't need time to answer. "I regret not speaking sooner, but never this." And in the days that followed, as more people began showing up outside the courthouse, some holding signs, some just standing quietly, Angela understood that what had begun as her story was no longer hers alone. It had become a mirror, a crack in the silence, a reminder to every person watching that truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just refuses to go away. The day of the verdict arrived with no fanfare, just an overcast sky, thick with the scent of coming rain, and the low hum of engines idling outside the courthouse steps. Angela stood on the sidewalk for a moment before walking in one hand wrapped around the handle of her umbrella, the other tucked into the deep pocket of her coat. She wore the same navy suit, the same black shoes, and a small silver pin shaped like a dove, one that had belonged to her mother, who'd always said dignity wasn't a performance, it was a discipline. Inside, the courtroom was filled but quiet, the kind of stillness that settles in before truth either becomes history or fades into another missed opportunity. The jurors filed in slowly, each one carrying the weight of what they'd heard over days of testimony, cross-examinations, and that grainy dashcam footage no one could forget once they'd seen it. The judge, a man known for brevity and caution, read the verdict with a voice, so even it felt like it had been practiced the night before in the mirror. Officer Travis Lyle was found liable for civil rights violations under federal law, excessive use of force, unlawful detainment, and procedural misconduct. The department itself was not criminally charged, but the jury recommended immediate oversight by the state attorney general's office and restitution to the plaintiff in full. The courtroom didn't erupt. There were no cheers, no applause. Just a collective exhale, the kind that ripples through a room when people realize something irreversible has just occurred. Angela didn't smile, didn't cry. She just closed her eyes for a second, long enough to feel her feet rooted to the ground and her breath anchored in her chest. As the judge thanked the jury and dismissed the proceedings, Officer Lyle sat stiffly at the defense table, his jaw-clenched eyes fixed on some invisible point on the wall. For a man who had walked into the courtroom believing in immunity, the sound of a guilty verdict didn't make him smaller, it simply made him real. No longer a uniform, no longer a policy. Just a man stripped of the excuses that once carried him through every stop, every lie, every name he never learned. Marcus stood at the back of the courtroom, one hand resting against the pew in front of him, his posture quiet but unflinching. He hadn't spoken during the trial, hadn't intervened or inserted himself into the legal process, but he had watched every hour, every witness, every long pause when Angela's truth forced someone else's comfort to bend. When she turned to leave, their eyes met across the room, and for just a second, something passed between them that neither law school nor childhood could ever fully explain. Angela stepped outside into the soft drizzle, the sky now darker, the wind shifting. A small crowd had gathered at the base of the courthouse steps. Neighbors, reporters, veterans, teachers, students, some with signs, some with flowers, all with questions. She didn't stop to give a speech. She didn't step up to any microphones. She simply paused beneath the awning, opened her umbrella, and looked out at the faces of people who for once weren't looking through her, but at her. One journalist called out gently, "Miss Freeman, do you feel justice was served?" She considered the question for a long beat, then answered without raising her voice, "Justice is a beginning, not an ending, and it doesn't fix what was taken, but it says at least once that we were seen." She didn't wait for follow-up questions. She descended the steps slowly, umbrella steady in her hand, and made her way back through the crowd, nodding at those who nodded first, stopping briefly when a young boy, no older than 7, handed her a drawing of a flag and said quietly, "My daddy says you're brave." Angela kneeled down, took the picture and smiled, not for the cameras, not for history, but for the boy. "Bravery isn't loud," she said gently. "It's just what we do when silence doesn't feel like an option anymore." That evening, back at home, she sat by the window with the drawing propped against a teacup and the newspaper folded in her lap. The headline read, "Court Holds Officer Accountable in Freeman Case Judge Orders Oversight." But the article wasn't what caught her attention. It was the smaller note in the bottom corner, "Statewide Review of Use of Force Policies Now Under Consideration." Marcus called just after sunset. "You did it," he said. Not with triumph, but with awe. Angela chuckled softly. "Number. We started it. Now they get to decide if they'll finish it." There was a pause. Then he asked more softly, "Do you feel any different?" She looked out the window at the rain streaking down the glass. "I feel like I stood my ground," she said. "And for once the ground didn't move beneath me." And in that quiet, as the night settled over her home like a blanket worn thin with memory, Angela Freeman allowed herself something rare and necessary. Not celebration, not relief, but rest. Because the battle for dignity isn't always won with noise or fire. Sometimes it's won by showing up again and again until the world is finally forced to look back. In the weeks that followed the verdict, Angela Freeman's name didn't trend. It didn't flash across every television screen or echo through Senate hearings. But her story, like water moving beneath stone, began to carve out something quieter, deeper, and far more permanent. The town didn't change overnight. No new monuments were raised, no parades were held, and no apologies came from those who had stood by when silence was the safest choice. But something had shifted, unmistakably so, and it lived in the way people looked at her now with acknowledgement, not pity. The first time she returned to the library after the trial, she found a single sunflower placed gently at the circulation desk. No note, no name, just a bloom bright enough to stand out against the gray carpet and worn counter, as if someone wanted to say, "We saw what you did. We remember." She didn't ask who left it. She simply put it in a jar of water behind the desk and went back to reshelving biographies like she had before, all steady steps and thoughtful hands, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. One afternoon, a group of high school students came in as part of a civics assignment, looking for books on local history and civil rights. Angela helped them find what they needed, answering questions in her usual calm voice, guiding them toward pages they might not have chosen on their own. As they packed up to leave, one girl lingered behind, nervously adjusting the strap of her backpack before speaking. "My mom said she used to come here when you worked nights," she said. "She told me you were always the same, even when people weren't." Angela looked at her, not surprised, just quietly moved. "That's what makes us stronger," she replied. "Not who sees us, but who we choose to stay." Word began to spread beyond town lines, not through headlines but through handshakes and barbershops and Sunday morning testimonies. Other small cities reached out asking if Angela would speak to their community boards or school assemblies. She declined most invitations, not out of fear or pride, but because she didn't want to become a symbol that people admired from a distance. She had never fought to be admired, only to be heard. But there were moments she agreed to. A reading circle at the local college. A church panel on justice and mercy. A quiet evening at a community center where she sat in a folding chair beside a retired school bus driver and a nurse trading stories about what dignity feels like when someone tries to take it from you. She never raised her voice. She never rehearsed. She simply spoke like someone who had survived being invisible and now wore that visibility like armor that didn't shine but didn't crack either. Marcus visited when he could, always arriving with something warm in a paper bag, coffee, peach cobbler, or cornbread from a bakery she liked. They sat in her kitchen or out on the porch sharing quiet updates about their lives, never discussing the trial unless she brought it up first. One evening he pointed toward the edge of the yard where the mailbox sat a little crooked from winter frost. "They're renaming the road, you know," he said, as casually as if he were noting a change in weather. "County Council voted last night. It'll be Freeman Ridge Highway by next month." Angela raised an eyebrow, half amused, half wary. "Well, I'll be." "All that and they still haven't fixed the pothole outside the diner," Marcus chuckled. "Change takes time, but it's coming." She looked out toward the horizon, her face quiet. "Let's just hope it stays when the cameras leave." The mailbox stayed crooked. The diner still burned the coffee. The local election brought in the same faces wearing slightly different slogans. But still something had shifted. A middle school history teacher added her testimony to the curriculum. A state legislator used her case in a floor speech about transparency in policing. And one day, as Angela walked through the grocery store in her usual wool coat and Sunday hat, a young officer in uniform stepped aside to hold the door open, eyes meeting hers not with obligation but with understanding. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. She nodded once and walked past, not hurried, not proud, just present. And that perhaps was the most radical thing of all. Not that Angela Freeman had demanded justice. Not that she had stood in a courtroom and exposed the cracks in a system designed to pretend it had no fault lines, but that she remained, in her town, in her rhythm, in her truth. She didn't move away, didn't reinvent herself, didn't disappear. She kept showing up in grocery aisles, on library floors, in conversations at bus stops and church pews, as a reminder that justice isn't something you chase and leave behind. It's something you carry quietly until the world is willing to carry it with you. A few months after the courthouse emptied, after the last article faded to the back of a search engine, and after the signs came down from the community center lawn, Angela and Marcus met at the edge of a small park just outside town. It was early spring, the kind of morning that still carried the chill of winter in its wind, but promised warmth just beneath the surface if you stayed long enough to feel it. The trees had only begun to bud their branches, delicate against the pale sky, and somewhere nearby, a cardinal called out once clear and sharp before going silent again. They didn't speak at first. Marcus held a paper bag with 2 cinnamon rolls from the old diner, and Angela carried a thermos of tea and 2 cups wrapped in a dish towel from her kitchen. They sat on a wooden bench overlooking a narrow creek, the water moving slow and clear over the rocks, steady, in a way that reminded her of how stories work best, not when they flood the world with noise, but when they return again and again to where they're needed most. He handed her one of the rolls, still warm. She poured the tea. The silence between them was not heavy now, just familiar, like a well-worn coat passed between seasons. "I brought you something," he said quietly, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a small velvet box. Angela raised an eyebrow. "You proposing to me, Judge Bell?" Marcus smiled, shaking his head. "No, ma'am. Just making sure you're properly documented." Inside was a bronze plaque, the kind that might go on a wall or sit on a shelf, simple and weighty. The engraving read, "She didn't raise her voice. She raised a judge." Angela read it twice slowly, then closed the box and held it in her lap. Her voice when it came was soft but certain. "Your mama would have called that a full-circle moment." Marcus nodded, eyes fixed on the creek. "She also would have said I talk too much and stand up too slow." Angela laughed, an easy, rich sound that carried over the water and startled a bird from the reeds. Then her gaze settled again, calm and far away. "You know," she said, "I never wanted to be the center of a story. I just wanted to walk home without being a suspect." Marcus didn't answer right away. Then softly, "But you didn't just walk home, Angela. You brought the road with you. And now it's clearer for everyone else." They sat a while longer, listening to the breeze through the bare trees and the gentle splash of water against stone. At some point she leaned back, closed her eyes, and let the sunlight warm her face. For the first time in a long while, she felt no tightness in her chest, no weight on her shoulders she hadn't chosen to carry. She didn't feel brave, she didn't feel tired, she just felt still. Later, as they stood to leave, Marcus offered to carry the plaque, but she waved him off. "No, baby," she said, tucking it gently under her arm. "This one I hold myself." And as they walked back toward the parking lot, their footsteps quiet on the gravel path, Angela looked out over the creek one last time and whispered to no one in particular, "Let them forget the headlines. Just don't let them forget the lesson." Because in a world that too often demanded noise to recognize truth, she had chosen another way. She had chosen to stand, to speak, to remain, and sometimes that's how justice wins, not with thunder, but with presence. What Angela Freeman's journey reminds us is that dignity doesn't always shout to be heard, sometimes it just refuses to stay silent. Her courage wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and deeply human. She stood up not just for herself, but for every person who's ever been overlooked, dismissed, or told their pain wasn't worth recording. In a world that often moves too fast and forgets too easily, Angela taught us that truth has a way of returning like water carving stone, not in waves but in persistence. She didn't seek revenge, she asked for recognition. She didn't demand applause, she asked for accountability. And in doing so, she reminded us that justice isn't always found in the courtroom. It often begins at the kitchen table with a decision to say, "Not this time." For those of us watching, especially those who've lived long enough to know the cost of silence, this story is a call to remember our strength, to speak when it's hard, to listen when it's easier not to, and to stand even when we're standing alone. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something worth holding on to, or someone worth standing up for, we invite you to share it. Let others feel what you felt. Leave a comment if her story reminded you of your own or someone you love. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications, because stories like this deserve to be seen, remembered, and passed on. Thank you for watching. And remember, justice begins with presence. and presence begins with people like you.